I'm Ariana Brocious.
I'm Kushan Avidar.
And this is Climate One. Kusha, I've been thinking back on your recent interview with former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy and how she talked about getting tar balls on her legs while swimming in the Boston Harbor as a kid. And I think it stuck with me because that's the kind of thing we don't really expect to happen today.
Yeah, I was interested in knowing what tar balls were in the first place. And I mean, not all of our waterways are pristine, but they're for sure a heck of a lot better than they were back in the 1960s.
And that's not by accident. Americans really started paying attention to how polluted some places were becoming when they were seeing the harm happen in real time. And so back in the 60s and 70s, there was this whole movement to start regulating industry to protect people and nature.
Exactly. I mean, there were a few laws on the books, but the 1970s were kind of a banner decade for environmental protections. Ariana, to wit, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the establishing of the Environmental Protection Agency, and so on. And fun fact, all of these were signed by President Nixon.
A Republican. And that's because things got so bad that it didn't used to be controversial to want to protect our air and our water and our public health. But over the years, that's changed. There's been a slew of new regulations put on industry, and that's not always welcome. And right now, President Trump is intent on eliminating or rolling back a huge number of these fundamental regulations. And one that's really important and kind of flying under the radar right now is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA.
NEPA, it's kind of like our country's environmental Magna Carta. It's a foundational law that requires federal agencies to tell communities when they're going to do something significant, like, hey, we're going to build a highway or open up a bunch of land for oil leasing, and they have to analyze the potential impacts of these projects.
Yeah, it's a bedrock environmental policy. But now the Trump administration wants to change how the law is used in some pretty major ways that will likely end up hurting communities, air, water, and wildlife. So I invited Sam Wojcicki, Senior Director of Climate Policy at the National Audubon Society, to walk me through what the administration is doing. He reminded me of what spurred Congress to pass the law in the first place.
Why do we have NEPA? As some people know, kind of the famous story is that the Cuyahoga River in Ohio burst into flames. And then that really caused Congress and the president at the time to really have a conversation about what decisions are we making in terms of the deployment of energy, infrastructure. How is the federal government playing a role in this and making sure that the public had that information? We've seen in the past how infrastructure kind of went in and, the federal government was able to just, wholesale decide this is where a highway is going. And
bulldoze
really
communities.
Exactly. Bulldoze communities, go through those communities. Those communities didn't have a voice. Neighboring communities didn't have a voice. And there was no process. People didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. And so really NEPA is about that transparency and about that opportunity for a dialogue with these kind of faceless agencies. So really what we're talking about is any time that a federal agency is making a decision that may impact a community. This can be permits for infrastructure that goes through a community. It can be energy extraction on public lands that might be nearby. This is really about your ability to understand what your federal government is doing and your ability to have your voice heard.
So this has been around for decades. It's a foundational environmental law in the U.S. And the Trump administration wants to change the National Environmental Policy Act, how it's basically deployed. So let's walk through some of these changes. You wrote a very helpful blog summarizing some of these key changes. So first, the idea is for each agency to create their own agency-specific regulations. Can you explain for an average person what this is going to mean?
Sure. So at the White House, there's a small agency called the Council for Environmental Quality, or CEQ. And historically, the way this has worked is CEQ comes forward and kind of writes the rules of the road for how agencies should use NEPA. We're talking 85 plus agencies. And so ultimately, CEQ sets the rules of the road. And then agencies will, come out with very small regulations that decide some of the very specific parts to their work, right? What's being proposed here is kind of a rewrite of that process. And so instead of having one rules of the road that CEQ issues, at this point, CEQ is saying we no longer are going to do that. And so we're actually going to ask all 85 agencies to write their own rules.
85 agencies. I just want to interrupt and say that's a lot. That's a lot of agencies to come up with their own new procedures.
Absolutely. What's frustrating here is, when we're talking about 85 agencies who haven't done this throughout their time of implementing NEPA, they may not have the staff to do this. They may not have the resources or the know-how. And so that's going to create uncertainty for infrastructure projects in the United States. It's going to slow down permitting. It could lead to increased litigation and increased compliance costs for these companies. It might even lead to some projects not moving forward.
Yeah, and what is sort of ironic here is that a large part of the criticism for the National Environmental Policy Act, for NEPA, is that it's slow and takes a long time and, is very bureaucratic. And so while the sort of intention perhaps is to do away with some of this burdensome regulation, it's actually going to probably slow things down further. So some of these other proposed changes applies to the way that a suite of different things are being analyzed at once. So this new proposal gets rid of the requirement that agencies analyze cumulative impacts of a decision. So can you briefly describe why that's important?
This really gets to the heart of what NEPA can do. When we're talking about cumulative impacts, what we're really looking at is, agencies are making a lot of different decisions, and there's a lot happening in the environment around these decisions. And so cumulative impacts is about making sure that we're not considering each decision being made, each permit for a piece of infrastructure in isolation, but actually looking at what the total impact could be. And of course, this is really important when we start talking about toxicity, right? If we're looking at how did we get to the point where a river caught on fire and it wasn't even flowing, it was oozing like sludge. Ugh. Well, that's because you make a lot of different decisions in a row without considering the kind of cumulative impact of all those decisions taken together. This is kind of the basis of why Congress made this law in the first place. And so it seems a little bit against the spirit of good, effective permitting to not look at this really kind of core part of how we can be responsible stewards and how we can make good decisions.
Right. And this goes back to this idea that there are now going to be 85 agencies making their independent reviews, not a central authority guiding that process. And so there's a few other changes I want to touch on because they're also very important. One is essentially excluding nearby communities from being considered in terms of project impacts. On its face, that sounds problematic. I'm wondering if you can give us an example of some of the work you've done where this really matters. I mean, this is about protecting people and the environment. So if the communities nearby aren't being considered, what's that going to mean?
Yeah, everything you've heard that's terrible about federal permitting not working well really starts because communities weren't at the table. And what we've seen in recent years is that when communities are brought in, oftentimes those biggest concerns that they might have can be addressed by the developer at low cost or no cost kind of solutions. And what's more is the community can find out ways that they can be a part of this project, right? We've seen community benefit agreements rise as this opportunity to get formal agreements between communities and developers to take some of the financial benefits of this project and reinvest them in the community. Mm-hmm. And from Audubon's perspective, that can be great for conservation, but it can also mean things like tangible benefits to the communities. It can mean a park, it can mean real infrastructure that has benefits. It can also mean an agreement to locally sourced jobs. So there's a lot of different ways this looks, but that's what happens when communities are a part of it. And excluding them will not only not get to that place of kind of happy harmony with these projects, but also is going to result in a place where those public health impacts, those noise impacts, those pollution impacts aren't getting considered from a human health standpoint as well, because the best experts are going to be the ones on the ground who know how previous infrastructure has impacted their health.
Yeah, the community benefits agreement is such an interesting thing that we have seen become more prominent. And there's so many ways that can help projects, as you say, become more harmonious with the community. In some cases, it just means that they get some of the power. If you're building a transmission line for solar energy, that community gets some of the solar. So they're benefiting directly from a transmission line through their community. So NEPA has become a favorite punching bag of pro-development and limited government actors for a really long time. Even among middle-of-the-road organizations, it's often seen as slow and sometimes excruciatingly tedious. By and large, environmentalists support this rule, but even some of those groups say it's slowing down the transitions we need to make. And so part of that does stem from insufficient numbers of people, insufficient staff of people who are supposed to actually be doing these analysis, and underfunding agencies, and then them not having the personnel to carry them out in an efficient manner. And so in the last few years, there have been changes put forward to NEPA that have accomplished some of the modernizing and improvements that critics say have been necessary for a long time. What have those changes been?
So in recent years, Congress kind of came together and hammered out a compromise through the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was overwhelmingly bipartisan. I think what first I'll say is really important to note here is that when we're talking about the Fiscal Responsibility Act, this kind of overwhelming bipartisanship extend to reaffirming NEPA. And I think that that's really important. But in terms of the changes that were made, they set timelines for review. So when a project moves forward through NEPA, there are two levels of review: an environmental impact statement, which is the kind of more in-depth. If there's really a concern that reaches a certain level, they're going to do what's called an EIS, an environmental impact statement, or an EA, or an environmental assessment. They set timelines there of 2 years for the more in-depth look and 1 year for the environmental assessment, really kind of making sure that agencies were following through. They encourage the use of what are called programmatic reviews. This is where you're looking at, for instance, there was one recently looking at solar infrastructure on public lands and really trying to understand, where can we prioritize these projects? Where are they going to have the least impact? What kind of impact should we be looking for? And these can then go on to inform specific projects and specific permits.
So almost like having a template, kind of.
Exactly. They allowed for project sponsors to prepare certain documents. They also set page limits on the review. And they also looked at categorical exclusions. So this is where there's something that we all have kind of agreed, or the agency has looked at and said, this really doesn't have a human health impact or an environmental impact that's usually that large. And they say, so long as it's under a certain amount, you can basically use this broad-based exclusion. So these are a lot of efficiencies that folks had talked about for a long time, some guardrails on how long and how arduous this process can be, that were invested in through the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It wasn't enough, but it was a good first step.
Right. And it seems like it's a bit too early to see how many of those changes will take effect. And then there's been this change of administration and a real, 180 in terms of how this rule is going to be implemented at all. And so recently, the U.S. Department of Interior announced it's going to fast-track permitting reviews for fossil fuel and critical mineral energy projects. Normally, these environmental impact statements under NEPA take a year or more. They're now supposedly going to take between 2 and 4 weeks. So what do you think those changes will mean in terms of how those projects might impact the communities around them and public health?
While moving more efficiently than those timelines they set up can be a good thing, it's only good if the permitting is effective. And so I think our concern is that what the Department of Interior is doing is attempting to use emergency powers to speed up the process without first ensuring that the resources are there to effectively permit in a way that upholds their core statutory responsibilities that Congress just reaffirmed. So, from our perspective, it's important that agencies follow the law and not engage in permitting for permitting's sake. We don't want a rubber stamp permitting system, but we want a process that actually ensures that infrastructure is safe for communities, wildlife, and our planet. We want to see a process that better integrates that, but also moves effectively and efficiently. And so ultimately, we appreciate the focus on trying to get infrastructure built. And Audubon is we have a 100 gigawatt goal through our clean energy initiative, where we're trying to support 100 gigawatts of clean energy and transmission by 2028. And that's directly at the project level. But importantly, we talk about it being responsibly sited. And that means talking to communities. That means considering wildlife impacts. So we want to move fast, but we don't want to, break the system as we're doing so.
Mm-hmm. Separately from National Environmental Policy Act, but in a kind of related sphere, the Trump administration has also proposed a rule changing the definition of the word harm in the context of the Endangered Species Act. So as it stands now, that word encompasses a lot of things. It includes the destruction of habitat as a kind of harm. The proposal is to limit that to only really include intentional killing or injury. If that rule moves forward, what will it mean for the work of groups like Audubon?
I think it's hard not to say that wouldn't be detrimental ultimately to our conservation work. From our perspective, it's really important that we follow both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law and really look at what has Congress said here. And the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to preserve the conservation of these critical species and to rebuild our ecosystems. And so ultimately, that is the approach that we believe any administration should be taking, is to really uphold that core stewardship and conservation.
Yeah, I think with so many environmental rollbacks coming out of this administration, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and, maybe that there's not much that can be done in the face of this emergency declaration and so forth. What can be done in your mind to kind of continue to move forward and try to protect these things that we value so much?
Congress has a role to play here, and it's our hope that Congress will step up and play that role. We have seen, going back to NEPA, we have seen that the reforms that they just made through the Fiscal Responsibility Act were starting to work. We watched as between 2019 and 2024, the median time for a federally prepared environmental impact statement fell from 3.6 years to 2.2 years. That's a huge fall. DOE had cut environmental timelines in half for EISs. DOT cut their time for environmental assessments by a third. These are really meaningful changes that were happening, and they were happening while keeping communities and wildlife organizations and public interest organizations at the table. And so, we think that Congress enabled those reforms, and it is up to Congress to speak very clearly and protect the work that they've done. Outside of Congress, what else can be done? Audubon works at the project level. And what we are seeing that I think is kind of the silver lining, and we talk about this all the time, is that there is a sincere economic motivation for kind of good, clean energy and transmission projects. There is an economic motivation to working with communities, regardless of what the rules are. And while I'm not, kind of being naive and saying that that's going to happen regardless, we do think that there's an opportunity to continue to work with developers to get responsible development, but get development that we need to meet the climate crisis as quickly as possible in terms of clean energy. There are state analogs to NEPA. There are state analogs to a lot of the environmental protection laws that we see at the federal level. And so this may be a case where states can really step up and fill in those gaps, and they still have control over the siting of infrastructure, even if they don't have the ultimate control over the federal permits. So, we are working with states to make sure that those protections stay in place while also recognizing there are opportunities here for improvements.
Sam Wojcicki is Senior Director of Climate Policy for the National Audubon Society. Sam, thanks for joining us on Climate One and sharing your expertise on this very complicated and wonky world of NEPA.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Coming up, this administration is dead set on eliminating climate and environmental regulations, but some people are pushing back.
We've just got to make this an all-inclusive, unified effort of people who love this country right now, and we just don't have a lot of time for division.
That's up next when Climate One continues.
As the Trump administration tries to roll back decades of climate and environmental regulations, some lawmakers on Capitol Hill are pushing back. One of those people is Congressman Jared Huffman. He's been in the House for more than a decade, representing California's 2nd District from the Golden Gate Bridge up to the Oregon border. He's currently ranking member of the House Natural Resources Committee. Huffman spoke with Greg Dalton on the Climate One stage during San Francisco Climate Week.
Lots been going on, lots to talk about for sure. I think Bloomberg summed it up with a headline, "Years of climate action demolished in days." There's so much going on aimed at public health, greenhouse gas emissions, just everywhere. How do you keep track of it all, and what's most on your mind?
Unfortunately, I have to try to track all of it, and that, could consume all my efforts just in the climate space, but I've got, the rest of the jurisdiction of the House Natural Resources Committee now that I'm the ranking member. And then I've got the broader attacks on our democracy and the economic chaos. So it is a lot. All of us are having our bandwidth tested in this.
That's the point.
Yeah, I think it is the point.
Yeah. So there's some who say that there's this weapons of mass distraction, that some of what we're seeing is like flash over there.
Yeah.
Look over there. It's because I don't want you to look over here.
Yeah.
How do you know what to focus on?
I haven't found a formula that I can articulate yet, but I think you have to take these things one at a time. And, you kind of figure out that maybe the fight over renaming the Gulf of Mexico is not, where we ought to put all of our effort. But there's some other stuff that we need to take very seriously. And I would argue that the things that are fundamentally focused at tearing down our democratic institutions, at establishing awful new precedents, such as what he's doing on immigration policy, his efforts to target political opposition. I mean, these are all major steps on the path to totalitarianism, and I sort of give those highest priority.
Right. I've been working on climate for almost 20 years and have often said like climate's sort of the meta issue. It's like if we don't have a stable climate, you don't have welfare, lots of things. And I'm actually more worried about democracy than climate in some ways.
I'm right with you. I think right now the biggest climate issue is democracy.
There's a business case for clean energy. It is cheaper. It can be profitable. It's clean. It's better in so many ways, clean energy. The business case for democracy is a business case on the other side, which is like you can make money undermining democracy with less democratic ways. That worries me.
Some people are getting fabulously rich at it, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, they are. Among the actions that's happening is the National Environmental Policy Act, something that is a little bit wonky, but it's a 55-year-old law that directs federal agencies to consider environmental and cultural impacts from new development projects. Now each agency is being asked to kind of look at it differently. Tell us why we should care about this. Why does it matter?
Right. Well, I mean, I could take you back to the bad old days of the 1960s and 70s when we didn't have some of these bedrock environmental laws. And there's probably a few people in your audience old enough to remember when we pronounced entire bodies of water like the Great Lakes devoid of aquatic life and never fishable again. When we were losing iconic species like our national bird, the bald eagle, because of DDT and so many other things. So these foundational environmental laws that were bipartisan when they passed, most of them in the 1970s, have really given us tremendous progress in the fight against that kind of environmental destruction. But they've always had opponents, and right now there is a lot of energy behind tearing them down. And certainly Donald Trump is doing that in every way that he possibly can.
Is there anything that states can do? What's the protection for that?
A state like California can do a lot and has done a lot. We've got state laws that mostly mirror all of our federal environmental protections and in many cases go further. And in some cases we had state laws like the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Act before we had the Federal Clean Water Act. So California has always been a leader in this space. The problem is water pollution doesn't stop at state boundaries. Air pollution doesn't stop. Wildlife move and go and without regard for state jurisdiction. So you really do need national standards and national laws to protect these natural and national resources.
Right. And we've seen, obviously in the first administration, there was sort of, attempts to shrink the EPA. These institutions can come back. That's a lot of what, Biden tried to do is, but is it different this time? What's happening in terms of the, approach to the EPA and others? We didn't have Elon Musk last time.
Yeah. It's just different in every way. Look, I've been fighting Republicans in Congress on some of these issues for as long as I've been there, and I'm in my 13th year now in Congress. So the attacks are not new, but the tactics and the ferocity and the impunity with which they're being advanced, that is new. I mean, Republicans that I have been working with used to have some limits to where they would go. They wouldn't call for outright repeal of things like the Endangered Species Act. They would say they supported all of the above energy portfolios. Mm-hmm. Look at what we're dealing with right now. I mean, Donald Trump has declared an energy emergency, a fake energy emergency, at a time when we're producing more energy of every kind that we ever have, more fossil fuel exporting. I mean, we're setting all kinds of records. But he's declared this crisis, this emergency, and then used it to try to fast track only fossil fuel projects.
Yeah, 'cause that emergency power gives him more power. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so just this week, they announced that they are going to pretend to reduce federal permitting for fossil fuel projects to just 28 days under this emergency that they have declared. And, my feeling is, I hope big oil is stupid enough to try to take advantage of that new permitting avenue that the president is attempting, because they will get sued and they will lose.
Well, but even, the head of ExxonMobil has said, we're not looking to expand supply right now because oil is what, $60?
Right.
The industry is not necessarily going to put a bunch of capital at risk, market where it is. So even though, the U.S. government can say these leases are available, it doesn't mean anyone bids on them. Doesn't mean anyone puts in there. So
we're awash in fossil fuels. There is no crisis. There is no emergency. There is a climate crisis because of all this fossil fuel extraction and burning. And that's really the problem. That's the moment that we're in.
EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has announced his agency will reconsider the so-called endangerment finding, a 2009 conclusion that carbon dioxide pollution endangers human health and welfare. This is the basis of many climate regulations. It's based on a Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts versus EPA. So what does it mean if he succeeds in getting rid of the endangerment finding?
Yeah, we have to find a better term for this endangerment finding because it sounds so esoteric to most people.
Right.
But what it really means is that carbon pollution is bad for people and bad for the environment. And that's like self-evident to anyone who listens to the science.
It's like RFK said, sugar is poison. They need to borrow some of that, right?
That's pretty straightforward.
Right.
But yeah, this was affirmed, upheld by the Supreme Court previously. It shouldn't be controversial at all. And to try to take it away, now that should be wildly controversial. And of course, that will be fought mightily in the courts. And the question is, whether some of these conservative justices will reach a different outcome this time.
Right. It just seems like there's the time offset is like so much is happening so fast. And like the courts are like this sort of like chasing after the bus after it's long gone. So how do you deal with like the time frames of the court's so slow, the executive branch through these imperial edicts moving so fast?
Yeah, time is probably the most vexing part of this whole challenge, because we're not just in a race against carbon pollution because of what it's doing to the planet and the fact that it's going to pretty soon unlock all kinds of terrible feedback loops that will make it even harder to stabilize the climate. But we have a narrowing window of time to stop it. And when these guys run out the clock in all of these different ways, when they try to rewind the clock by making coal great again and doing all of these things that you're seeing from this administration, they're not going to be successful in the long term, but they're going to take time away. And that really hurts our ability to do the right thing.
So we've been following kind of there's this talk about taking a scalpel to the Inflation Reduction Act or a sledgehammer, because there's been Republicans from New York and elsewhere who've said, oh, slow down, keep that in place. What's the timeline? How's that going to play out?
What it'll probably involve is trying to auction off a bunch of public lands to make some money for their billionaire tax cuts. It'll probably involve, putting a big thumb on the scale for a bunch of fossil fuel development and then trying to pretend that that'll bring a bunch of revenue in to help pay for the tax cuts. But there'll be a lot of action in other committees, and it'll be in the Ways and Means Committee where those tax credits get fought out. And we're about to find out, we've got 20 or so House Republicans that have written a letter with some wiggle room in the letter saying that they do not want to do away with those IRA tax credits. But it's not clear to me that, when Donald Trump leans in and starts twisting arms, that those guys will stand their ground. You could imagine some of them defending battery storage and some other things because manufacturing has located in some of their districts. Certainly some of them like biofuels. A lot of them like the carbon capture stuff because that's not even a climate solution. That's basically an oil and gas giveaway. So, it's a real mix, and it will be interesting to see what's left standing at the end of that.
And then the goal is to extend the 2017 tax cuts, right, and to find the money to pay for that. And so what's the timeline? Is that something that's going to happen before summer recess? What's the time horizon?
They've said before Memorial Day, and I do not think they're going to meet that deadline. But certainly things are going to heat up in the House very quickly, and we're going to get very busy on it.
Right. So we're talking a lot about the bad things that are happening, though there is, certainly questions the Democratic brand is pretty tarnished right now. People are wondering,
I've heard about that.
where are the Democrats? David Brooks, conservative columnist at the New York Times, recently wrote that the administration is like a supercar with 1,000 horsepowers, and Democrats are like scurrying around on mopeds. So what do the Democrats stand for now? It's easy to say we're against him, but what does the party and you stand for?
Well, look, the Democratic Party, those words always make me bristle a little
big
bit.
Coalition.
It is a complex organism, and I am a small fiber in that organism. But all I know is that I have some fellow Democrats that I serve with that I think stand for all the right things and are great champions and great messengers, and I see so much courage and leadership from them every single day. The public clearly is seeing something else or wanting to see something else. And I don't really know how to answer that except to explain that we do not have a singular strongman leading our cult like the Republicans do.
You don't have even a leader at all.
We don't have it because we're not in a presidential cycle. It's probably a year or two before we even have a strong sense of who the leading candidates for president the next time around are going to be in the Democratic Party. So I hope people will look to some of the great leadership. I think Hakeem Jeffries is doing a great job. I think my colleague Jamie Raskin, who I had in my district for the last couple days, is a phenomenal leader and a great messenger. And we've got so many other colleagues. I think Chris Murphy is out there doing amazing things. And there's others. I could go on and on. There's no lack of talent.
AOC and Bernie Sanders.
AOC and Bernie are bringing fantastic energy to the country at a time when we really need it. So it's going to be, I think, a platooning, a team effort from the Democrats here for the next couple of years. And I hope people stop longing for that messaging messiah to sort of deliver us from all of our angst. It's a little more complicated than that.
More than 500 political scientists recently filled out a survey saying the U.S. is moving swiftly from liberal democracy towards some form of authoritarianism.
Absolutely.
And your Democratic Party elected kind of a status quo guy to lead it, right?
I don't know anything about the DNC chair or how to characterize that. All I know is that my congressional Democratic colleagues and I are fighting this tooth and nail in every way we can. We are in the courts where we have standing and can be. We are working with litigants who do have standing and are in the courts. We are monitoring compliance with the 70-plus court orders that we've had that in one way or another have checked Donald Trump's power. We are at rallies and protests and trying to use every bit of our platforms and communication tools. And we're using the limited tools we have in the minority in Congress, the parliamentary mechanisms, the spotlight of our hearings and the bills we introduce and the messaging we do. So the will and the fight is there. We've just got to make this an all-inclusive, unified effort of people who love this country right now, and we just don't have a lot of time for division and I think hand-wringing and recrimination.
Right, and then the idea is that people haven't seen, this is David Brooks calling for, this kind of sort of uprising, and he's saying transpartisan. It can't be the usual sort of left-right, can't be just Bernie and AOC, because that seems like the typical kind of, it's partisan. Yeah. That's like politics as usual. And many people are saying this is not politics as usual.
It's got to be bigger than that.
But what's lacking is something that people will give themselves up for. That is, Brooks has been saying this. We need to not just say, this is bad. What are we for?
I think that we are starting to see, and in the weeks and months ahead, we'll see even more, how the breakdown of our democratic checks and balances and the erosion of our institutions actually does translate to things that hurt people. I take no joy in that. I think it's going to be awful. But you're going to see it in so many different ways. And it's going to start to threaten and hurt people in very direct ways where the dots will connect. And it should happen. I hope it happens quickly.
So I wanted to talk about Noah. Most people, think it's a biblical character. What's Noah? It's
the other Noah.
The other Noah. People haven't heard of Noah, but if you look at your phone app to what clothes to wear, or logistics companies rely on data from NOAA to is your package going to arrive on time?
Yeah.
So tell us about what's, happening at NOAA and why we should care.
Yeah. NOAA is one of those federal agencies that does so much for Americans every single day that they really have no idea. So yeah, weather is like a big one because all of the climate data, all the climate science that we do at the national level, it resides at NOAA. And so many of these data sets and tools that they develop and maintain are just made publicly available to everyone. So when you go to weather.com or when you see your weather forecast in the nightly news, that's all coming because of NOAA. And it's accurate because of NOAA. When you get forecasts and mapping for hurricanes and storms, and when you get warnings for red flag conditions for fire dangers so that we can avoid catastrophic wildfire, that's all NOAA science and NOAA expertise that's making that possible. So this is an agency that does such mission critical things for Americans every single day. And these fools from DOGE who don't understand that are just ransacking through the data, cutting things and cutting people that they really fundamentally just don't even understand.
We've been hearing about permitting reform for a number of years. This was supposed to be an area where Democrats want transmission for renewables, Republicans want oil and gas pipelines. Let's open it up and we can each kind of have what we want. Hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Well, there's still a lot of conversation about it. What might change the conversation is, frankly, all of this new demand we're seeing from AI. So where this got bogged down in the last Congress was that most Republicans really didn't want to do energy transmission. They wanted to do pipelines. And that was their notion of permitting reform. It's fossil fuel all the way. And they were kind of threatened by energy transmission and FERC reform and other things that are holding back clean energy because they want their fossil fuel stuff.
And FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that governs cross-state transmission of energy.
Yeah, exactly. But with all of this demand from AI, I think even those Republicans are starting to acknowledge we're going to have to do a lot more transmission upgrading just to meet that demand.
Of the data center demand, okay.
Yeah. So I think maybe there's a little bit more of a bipartisan flavor to the transmission piece of permitting reform. The problem is they still want to just open it wide open for fossil fuel in ways that should be deeply troubling to anyone that cares about the environment or some of these disadvantaged communities that always bear the brunt of fossil fuel pollution or the climate crisis, because they might even say we're going to make it technology neutral, do all this permitting reform, but they're doing all this other stuff over here to kill off clean energy.
The question often comes up in climate conversations, what can I do? People are overwhelmed right now. Some people are just checking out. Some people are activating. One person I heard says the best thing you can do is adopt a local institution, civic
That's
institution.
a good thing to do. Yeah.
Because a takeover would have to happen at the local level, really. What's your answer to people ask you, Congressman, what can I do?
Well, the one thing you definitely should not do is wallow in the pit of despair or be alone. That's kind of what they want. The authoritarian playbook is to divide us and overwhelm us and to fill us with fear and intimidation and existential angst. So, look, we all feel some of those things. It's hard not to with the fire hose, the flood the zone that we've been dealing with. But we got to pretty quickly get in a mindset of powering through this thing. And Together, yeah. It's got to be a big, engaged coalition. And I think the local stuff does matter. I think all types of civic engagement are part of this. Showing up at town halls, showing up at rallies and protests, showing up at a Tesla dealership, whatever is your, sort of flavor of engagement. And then I'll just throw out one more thing. Support the big national environmental organizations because right now they are in the crosshairs. And you see what Donald Trump is doing to all of his political enemies. You see how he's going after higher education. You see how he's going after law firms and individual judges. The big climate groups, the big environmental groups have a target on them right now, And he and Republicans in Congress are going to be coming after their tax-exempt status. They're going to be doing so many things that put them back on their heels, and they're going to need our support too.
Coming up, while the Trump administration is making bold moves to roll back climate policy, actually changing laws might not be that easy.
It's not to say that I don't think that the administration intends to make good on the plans that it's announced, but there's still a long way before laws and regulations are actually changed.
We'll be right back.
Ariana, I don't know about you, but for me, it's been really difficult to keep up with all the changes the Trump administration is making to, every part of government, but especially climate policy.
Yeah, there's been so much in the news, and I think it's partly on purpose. I feel like they're just trying to kind of overwhelm us so that you can't focus on any one particular thing, you know?
Totally. Yeah, I hear you. And thankfully, there are some tools out there that have helped me at least keep up to date with what's happening to climate laws. One of those tools is the Climate Backtracker. Olivia Guarna is a climate justice fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, and she manages the Climate Backtracker.
So for the Climate Backtracker, we draw information from primary government sources. So that can include anything from White House announcements, agency press releases, anything that's published in the Federal Register, which has things like final rules, proposed rules, notices from agencies or the White House, executive orders, memoranda from agencies or the White House, all these sorts of things. It's based on government primary source material, although sometimes updates will come to our attention through the media first because, some news breaks there first before it's announced on agency websites. But we always try to do that sort of verification with the government sources.
What was the moment for you when you felt compelled to start compiling things? Was this something that you took on yourself?
No, so the Climate Backtracker is actually part of a much longer standing project by the Sabin Center. We relaunched the Climate Backtracker specifically on Inauguration Day, but it was sort of the third iteration of these kinds of trackers. We wanted to keep track of, federal climate-related regulation, and we started doing this in the Obama administration. We launched the Climate Deregulation Tracker at the first Trump administration, and then we launched the Climate Re-regulation Tracker for the Biden administration, and then again, the Climate Backtracker. And all of that data is still available on the Sabin Center's website. We call it the Climate Regulation Database. But yeah, it's part of a sort of longer effort to keep track of climate-related regulation or deregulation and identify trends, things like that.
Can you take me back to Inauguration Day just for you as a person when you're sitting there and you say that you're relaunching it? What did that moment feel like?
Well, it's funny. We knew that there would be a flurry of activity on the first day. So we wanted to have all of our, resources up and running on Inauguration Day to be able to record those initial executive orders. And I was the one who was charged with that task. So I was sort of sitting around most of the day, kind of waiting for that shoe to drop. And it was later in the evening that we started getting executive orders from the White House website. But once they started, they were coming in floods. This second Trump administration has been very active with executive orders. I would say probably even more so than the first one. We saw that on the first day. So inauguration night, I spent kind of adding all of these executive orders to the Backtracker.
Yeah. So do you spend a lot of your days just on the internet trudging through all the different Twitter accounts of these different public records and just trying to keep track? Is your algorithm just really depressing, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask?
It definitely can be. Especially between the three trackers that I work on, it's a lot of time spent Googling on agency websites, just going through, trying to sort out all of this massive information that's always coming down. And things change really quickly. So the task of just trying to get a handle on what's going on in what feels like oftentimes a very chaotic environment can be, time consuming.
Yeah, I'm sure. So I want to go through some of the actions that you've cataloged. So there's, for instance, FEMA stops implementing flood risk management rules. There's the Department of Energy relaxing rules governing natural gas exports. The Defense Department cancels research on climate change impacts. These are some of the things that you're tracking yourself. This one has broken 100 actions, right? 106. I'm wondering, can you put this in perspective for us? In your opinion, are you able to like rank them by most concerning or egregious? Is there anything that really stands out to you as concerning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one thing I'll note is that today, the day that we're recording, is April 30th, and that marks President Trump's 100th day in office. So this week at the Sabin Center, we've been doing a lot of high-level analysis on President Trump's first 100 days in office. And one thing that is notable is that there are almost double the number of actions that we recorded this time around by the 100th day compared to the first Trump administration. A much greater portion of those are executive orders. A lot of it has been agency announcements. Those are sort of indications of big plans that the administration has, but they're not necessarily where the rubber hits the road. The administration is going to have to actually take formal steps to carry out a lot of the deregulation that it's anticipating. But I mean, there's a lot of things that are concerning. EPA announced, I think, what it called the greatest day of deregulation our nation has ever seen, or something, where it indicated that it was going to tackle some 30 long-standing regulations, which have very critical climate implications. So when the agency starts to take formal action on those, that's going to be something of big concern. Other big ones, I would say, are the Council on Environmental Quality's purported repeal of all of its implementing regulations for the National Environmental Policy Act. That was one that should have been, I think, huge news, but kind of flew under the radar, at least for a little while. But that has massive implications for environmental review of all kinds of projects. The FEMA decision to stop implementing the federal flood risk management standard, which is designed to prevent flood damage in a variety of types of buildings like schools, libraries, fire stations, which obviously, given the climate impacts, is a pressing issue. And its decision to stop implementing that standard was first announced internally and really wasn't announced publicly until weeks later, and even then with very little fanfare. So it's these sorts of updates or actions that are possibly less flashy for the administration, but have real sort of concrete climate implications.
Did I catch it right when you said that by this moment in the last Trump administration, 100 days in, there was about half of the orders that you've tracked compared to this administration's 100 days?
Yeah, by the first 100 days of President Trump's first term, we had tracked 51 actions in total, and 5 of those were executive orders. And as we already mentioned, so far we've had 106 total actions and 20 executive orders.
And you also mentioned that it's not necessarily where the rubber hits the road, if I'm understanding it correctly, that there's a lot that needs to happen after to actually implement what's said. So for you, what do you make of double the number of output by 100 days in? Like, does it give you a lot of heartburn? Is it just like posturing? What do you make of it?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's all posturing. I think that the agencies fully intend to follow through on the plans that they're announcing. But it does mean that so far, it may seem as though the administration has accomplished more than it has by this point. There's lots of bold language, big plans, and in reality, agencies have to go through certain processes to be able to repeal regulations and things like that. And all of those steps create opportunities for lawsuits to prevent unlawful deregulation and things like that. So it's not to say that I don't think that the administration intends to make good on the plans that it's announced, but there's still a long way before laws and regulations are actually changed.
Yeah, I see. So what do you know about who's using this database and what they're using it for?
I think a lot of journalists rely on the database, as far as I understand. I think one of the real benefits of the database is that it just collects all of this information in a way that can be organized and helps understand the scope of action. But it's also really meant to be a tool for the general public to just understand what's going on. Like I said, it's a very chaotic environment right now. It's really hard to keep track of everything that's going on. And so just to have everything in one place is helpful for the public to understand and really grapple with what the administration has been doing.
Yeah, and Olivia, I gotta wonder, like you're talking about journalists and the public consulting this list. You're looking at this list every day. How does that feel for you? I mean, do you feel despair? What's going on for you emotionally?
I mean, with the backtracker and, with everything else that's going on, sometimes there's definitely a little bit of despair in there. But I think it's helpful to keep things in perspective. We were here last time tracking the same sorts of things. We're recording a lot of actions more quickly, but a lot of the flavor of deregulation and, attacks on science, things like that are similar. And I think having a good understanding of what's going on is what enables people to sort of resist unlawful actions that are being taken. So that's sort of something that gives me hope.
Yeah, it's good to find hope where you can. And, you need to keep it sustainable, right? Like somebody's got to keep this list going. Another database that you help manage, which I think you might have just referred to, you mentioned science. You also help manage the silencing science database. And to date, fact check me if there's more, you've recorded more than 550 efforts to interfere with the research and often the critical research that goes into doing climate change and many other fields. 550, is that right?
Over 600 now.
Okay, so broke another one.
But that's, that the Silencing Science Tracker was launched under the first Trump administration. And then we saw that through the Biden administration and now the second Trump administration. And we also record state actions. So that's sort of since 2017, a bird's eye view of government attacks on science.
So it crosses administrations. We're looking since 2017, you've recorded more than, you and your colleagues have recorded more than 600 efforts to interfere with that research. Can you tell me what those 600 actions look like?
Yeah, sure. So, I can start by just telling you what we've seen in the last few months. And it has a sort of similar tenor to what we saw in the first Trump administration and in states and things like that. This Trump administration, we've seen mass layoffs, including layoffs of scientists, federal scientists, deleting data and critical information from federal websites, terminating research initiatives, for example, research that looks at the health impacts of climate change, but also things that are not related directly to climate change, like COVID-19 or other medical research, initiatives that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also look at personnel issues, which could be retaliatory firings, or it could also be just appointing people who are unqualified to key positions. That's something that we've seen in this administration as well. Censorship issues. And then at the state level, what we also see a lot of is interference with education. So we see a lot of bills that regulate the way climate science is taught in schools, things like that.
Yeah, it's a broad range. So if I asked you to kind of give a bird's eye view of what kind of harm comes from these actions, is there a general thesis that you could offer about that?
I think the story that the tracker tells is just that science is under attack, and clearly under some administrations more than others. But, we've recorded actions from governments that we wouldn't necessarily associate with this type of activity. And I think that is really such a disservice to our society. Scientific research is critical to the fight against climate change, but it's also critical to advances in the medical industry and space exploration and all of these things that are important to and serve the American people nationwide and people around the globe.
Yeah, in some ways, actions speak louder than words, and what you're compiling is a list of actions that paint a narrative, as you just said. Yeah. And we had also talked about kind of how much more aggressive this Trump administration was in terms of its orders, at least. And to kind of go back to that a little bit, how much do you think of Trump 2.0's actions could be undone by the next president?
It will sort of depend on how the Trump administration rolls out those actions. But there are processes for doing and undoing regulation under the Administrative Procedure Act. That kind of process is contemplated. And what we're noticing in the Trump administration so far is that it's sort of trying to evade some of those procedural safeguards that the Administrative Procedure Act has. But the reality is regulations that are done can be undone. So I think, in a new administration, the rollbacks that President Trump is trying to accomplish can be undone again.
Yeah. A lot of these actions are going to be challenged in court. And I want to talk about the third database, the climate regulation database.
Well, the climate regulation database is where we house all of the data that we've accumulated from the Obama administration on regulations that relate to climate change. And we also record in that database litigation actions that sort of respond to the regulatory actions. So that gives a really comprehensive view about, how regulations have changed over time, what different administrations are interested in. It's really good background information to sort of help predict what might happen in the future, how litigation might play out, all of things like that. But it's really meant to be a repository of information across administrations.
Do you have any sense of how many of Trump's recent deregulatory actions have been already challenged?
So I can speak to what I've been focusing on primarily, which is his attacks on federal funding. I think that's one of the areas where the Trump administration has been moving most quickly, which I think is mostly just a function of the fact that the executive branch has a little bit more direct control over federal dollars. Whereas if the Trump administration tries to undo regulations, that's a bit more time consuming. There are processes that he needs to follow and agencies need to follow in order to do that. But we've seen very immediate steps taken to interfere with federal funding that has already been awarded through the Inflation Reduction Act or other congressional appropriations. And these are things like government-wide funding freezes, some targeted attacks on specific programs, and even grant terminations in some cases. And there has been a lot of pushback in courts on those actions. There have been several lawsuits filed to challenge the funding freezes and grant terminations. It's still very early in that litigation, but so far plaintiffs have been fairly successful in securing temporary relief, which essentially means that, courts are saying while the litigation is pending, the Trump administration cannot affect its funding freezes. It has to sort of release those funds. But like I said, there's sort of a long road ahead in that litigation. And there are definitely other lawsuits across the board that have been filed.
So you're a climate justice fellow at the Sabin Center. How does this work of keeping up these databases intersect with climate justice?
Oh, in a lot of ways. I mean, in some ways, we're tracking specifically the sort of attacks on climate justice and environmental justice specifically, which has been a big part of President Trump's first 100 days in office. On his very first day, he issued a couple of executive orders that really laid out plans to attack environmental justice initiatives and, in parallel, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. And agencies have since been taking steps to sort of implement that. So, again, we're seeing a lot of interference with federal funding that really affects environmental justice. We've seen agencies entirely eliminate environmental justice offices, put staff on administrative leave, cancel programs. So the administration is definitely taking a pretty sweeping and coordinated approach to walking back environmental justice initiatives from the previous administration. And that's something that we're definitely tracking.
Olivia Guarna is a climate justice fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Olivia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey everyone, it's Kusha and Ariana again. Before we go, we wanted to try and offer you something else interesting, a little tidbit to finish out the episode. We don't know what the name of the segment's going to be yet. Right now, we're going with Climate One More Thing. I brought something to share today. Ariana, may I share it with you?
Please do.
Okay, so I used to be a math teacher and I love factoids about numbers. And something cool that I learned over the weekend has to do with how we measure temperature in degrees Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit. Most people know they are on different scales. So like 32 degrees Fahrenheit is 0 degrees Celsius. But there is one temperature at which Fahrenheit and Celsius have the same numerical reading. It's the same number. And I'm going to ask you, do you want to guess what it is? Do you already know?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. I want to guess something, like in the 100 range?
Okay, so I love the enthusiasm. We got to go in the opposite direction to the negatives. The number, the number. Drum roll, please. It's -40. -40 degrees Fahrenheit and -40 degrees Celsius measure the same temperature, which I thought was really interesting.
Wow, cool. Okay, so tuck that in your pocket for your next cocktail party.
Yes, very cool indeed, because it is quite freezing. Anyway, that's the Climate One More Thing for this week. Thanks for listening. That's our show. You can see what our team is reading by subscribing to our newsletter. Sign up at climateone.org.
Climate One is a production of the Commonwealth Club. Our team includes Greg Dalton, Brad Marshland, Jenny Park, Kushan Avadar, Austin Colon, Megan Basilia, Kevin Lemons, and Ben Testani. Our theme music is by George Young. I'm Ariana Brocious. Thanks for listening.